This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is October 9th, 2020, and I'm producer Pat. We have two interesting segments for you today. Adam does a deep dive into whether an Irish court ruled that Subway sandwich bread is not really bread, and Christina and I had a conversation with Dr. Stuart Robbins. We asked Stu to come on regarding a listener's email about how we calculate the mass of a planet. We also get into the difference between weight and mass. I should mention this was recorded at the same time as the segment with Stu last week, which may help explain the exchange at the beginning. Before that, though, I wanted to take a minute on behalf of the whole TRC crew to talk about something we don't nearly do enough, and that is to thank you. Doing the show can be a pain sometimes. I mean, it is work, but we love it. It's given us the opportunity to become friends with Stuart Robbins and Stuart Pheromones and the Ken Milnes of the world. That's just to name a few of the awesome guests we've had on, but those are a couple that have turned into real friendships because of this podcast. It's a real privilege to make the show, and we could not make it without you. An extra special thanks to those of you who have supported us financially either through the PayPal button on our great website or via Patreon. As we have always said, if you can't afford it, we don't want your money. But for those of you who can and choose to help cover the cost of the show, know we really appreciate it. We've experimented with ads in the podcast and we remain open to them, but we're so picky about how many we allow and where they appear and what products we can support given the nature of the show. It just makes it sort of difficult. Okay, last thing I wanted to mention is that the crew will be taking next week off, but we will talk to you in 2 weeks. And with that little bit of listener appreciation out of the way, here's our discussion with Stuart Robbins.
Welcome back, our dear friend, Dr. Stuart Robbins.
Thank you to my favorite co-hosts on my favorite podcast, as well as the missing favorite co-host. It's been so long since I've spoken with you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. It's been minutes, I think.
Seconds.
We recently received a lovely email from Alouette, a British expat who is 81 years young and a, quote, happy Canadian now. See, Stuart, you too could be a happy Canadian.
We'll see what happens.
Here's the email. I listened to you talking about the weight of the Earth, but I don't understand how it can weigh anything because our weight depends on gravity, doesn't it? We weigh less on the moon, though our girth is the same. So the weight of the Earth would only be possible if it was on a much bigger something with the same gravity. So like money, it's just an exercise in belief. So I deny the truth on the only thing you've ever said that I disagree with. Thank you so much for the show. I love learning new things. Plus, it's good for your brain. So thank you for maintaining my brain health too. Thank you, Alouette.
So I'm going to jump in here because this is in reaction to a question that was asked in a game. And I was very careful to use the word mass instead of weight. Mm-hmm. But Stuart, what's going on here?
Mass and weight, they can be confusing because we use them incorrectly in everyday language. Mm-hmm. So just like the idea of a hypothesis versus a theory is confusing to people who use it wrong every day, it's the same thing here. So before I ask you to throw out everything you know about weight, I'm going to ask you how much you think, I'm not going to say you, how much do you think Holden, your dog, weighs?
So I'd say he's 22 or 23 kilograms, maybe 50 pounds.
So that's actually wrong. That is not his weight. That would be his mass. Now that we've done that exercise, I'm going to ask you to throw out of your mind everything you think you know about weight. And everything that you think you knew about weight is probably mass. So your mass is how much material there is in your body or any body. And that is measured in kilograms or pounds or a unit of mass, effectively. So that's what mass is. It is the amount of material that is there in something. It is an inherent property of matter. Matter has mass. Now the question about weight is basically one of how does that mass behave in a gravitational field?
Isn't my mass the same on Earth, in space, wherever?
Exactly. It's an inherent property of you, an inherent property of the atoms that make up your body. And that doesn't change wherever you are. So on Earth, under the sea, in Earth's core, on the sun, if you could survive, on Pluto, you would have the same mass. But you would have a very different weight, because weight is how your mass behaves under the influence of a gravitational field. So on the surface of the Earth, we have a gravitational field. We experience our everyday lives on the surface of our planet, which has almost the same gravitational field regardless of where you are on the surface. It's not quite the same because you are a slightly different distance from the center of the planet, but for all intents and purposes, roughly the same. Because of that, then we simplify mass and weight all the time to effectively have them be the same thing because they're proportional to each other. Because if gravity isn't really changing, then weight is going to always be proportional to mass. It's just going to be different by a multiplicative factor. In this case, the surface gravity at Earth's surface. What you would do in order to calculate your weight on the surface of Earth is you would take your mass in kilograms and multiply by the local gravitational field, which on the surface of Earth, regardless of where you are on the surface, is approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. So that means that your actual weight is not given in kilograms. It's given in kilograms times meters per second squared. Those units would be newtons. We take your mass, or in this case, Holden's mass, and we multiply it by the gravitational acceleration where he is, which is approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. And we would get a weight for Holden of very, very roughly 220 newtons. If Holden were on the moon, then you would still take his roughly 23 kilogram mass, and you would multiply by the local gravitational acceleration on the moon, which is about 1.6 meters per second squared, I think, which would make him roughly, if I can do math in my head, somewhere around 40-ish newtons. So that way we have the same mass, but he weighs something different on different surfaces. If you were to take him on an elevator, and that elevator were to accelerate quickly downwards, then he would also experience less weight because his local acceleration is going to be different, and so he would experience less weight going down. If the elevator were pushing up, then he would experience more weight, even though, again, his mass is going to be effectively the same. And for that one or two listener who's going to say, but you're getting closer to the speed of light, and so your mass actually does change, ignore it.
All right, so Stuart, jumping back to the original question.
Yes, because we got lost in that.
Mass and weight aside, given the fact that I talked about mass, how would we calculate the mass of the Earth?
There's Kepler's laws of planetary motion, which tell us basically how the planets move. Mm-hmm. One of them, it relates an object's distance to the time it takes to go around an object that it's orbiting. So, for example, the moon goes around Earth, and we can use Kepler's law to say, yes, this law checks out. Now, there is a more precise form of Kepler's law that actually uses a bunch of gravitational constants and mathematics constants and other things that allows you to, instead of say things are proportional, to actually calculate that value from first principles. In other words, to actually put in numbers and say, well, instead of days and months or years or whatever, I can actually say meters and I can say seconds and other things. The way to do that is you have to know what those constants are. And when we first measured the gravitational constant, when they were first able to do that over 200 years, I think, after these laws were formulated, then they were able to effectively calculate the mass of Earth because of Kepler's law and the orbit of the moon. What you do in order to measure the mass of planets or asteroids or moons or the sun or other stars is that you have to look at how it affects other bodies around it. So for measuring the mass of Earth, we have to look at how it affects satellites in Earth orbit, or because it was done before the dawn of the space age, how we look at natural satellites in orbit, in this case the moon, and then we have to use various gravitational constants and physics constants and fancy formula that were figured out a long time ago. Once we do that, we can actually figure out and measure the mass of a body. If we don't have that, then we can't. So if you look at a random star and it does not have a binary star with it, we don't know its mass. If you have a random asteroid and it doesn't have a satellite, we don't know its mass. We can estimate it. We can say, well, if it's rock, it has probably this density, and we can, if we can resolve it with, fly by it with a spacecraft, we can get a rough shape, and so we can get a volume, and so we can use density and volume to get mass. But if we don't have that, we can't do it. So this is why, for example, estimates of Pluto's mass used to be huge, but then they decreased over time. But then, once we found its satellite, its largest natural satellite, Charon, we were able to get its mass very precisely, because we can look at how far Charon is from Pluto, how long it takes to go around it, and we can use those physics constants in order to calculate its mass. This is why having a moon is actually really important. I'm involved in some planning for a mission that hasn't been launched yet, and one of the key things that we want to figure out is the mass of these asteroids that we'll be visiting with this spacecraft, and there are 2 ways to do it in the mission planning. And the first way, and it's listed as the primary best way to do it, discover a satellite.
Right.
Because if we have the satellite, then we can do it. And the second way to do it is, as the spacecraft goes by, its trajectory will be deflected very slightly based on that object's mass. We can track from Earth how it is deflected by the object, and we can calculate its mass that way too, but a satellite would be best.
So it literally becomes momentarily the satellite.
Interesting.
Sort of, yeah.
Stuart, I also was reading a speculation about whether the Earth gets heavier or lighter. Part of that argument had to do with population and things piling on the Earth, but also the argument that it's getting lighter because we're losing hydrogen through our atmosphere, which makes the Earth lighter. Is that something that you could speak to at all?
Yes, well, so it gets heavier when it eats ice cream, and it gets lighter when it eats celery. Earth is constantly gaining material, so it is gaining mass, and it is constantly losing material, so it is losing mass. Atmospheric escape happens, so it is losing material, volcanoes blowing out stuff, and then just random motions of molecules and atoms in the atmosphere as they go up and up and up and up and up, they eventually have enough speed in the right direction to escape Earth's gravitational pull. But we are also accumulating material because space dust hits us, and more rarely a larger asteroid or a comet will come in and hit, and we will gain material that way. I've read estimates that literally tons of material is raining down on Earth daily from space. So I don't know the numbers off the top of my head of what the actual amount in versus out is, but basically, if you think of Earth as having a constant mass, you're wrong. The amount of change is very, very small. Tons of material might seem like a lot, but Earth has a mass of something like 10 to the 24 kilograms. So adding 10 to the 3 does nothing to really change it. Even if it's daily, even if it's over many, many, many years. So even if it is, say, losing 10 to the 3 kilograms of material, and it's done that for 1 billion years, you're talking about 10 to the 12th. That is still dwarfed by an actual mass of 10 to the 24. It's 0.000000000001%, something like that. On Earth, that's one thing. Comets are a different story. They are outgassing a lot more material, and they have a lot less to work with. Pluto is also constantly losing its atmosphere to space. It is a lot smaller than Earth, but it is still a lot more massive than a comet. And so a lot of different bodies in the solar system are constantly losing and gaining material, and they're doing it at different rates, and they have a different amount to work with from the get-go. And so we live in a dynamic and always changing and always fascinating solar system and universe at large.
Well, Stuart, as always, thank you for coming on the reality check and breaking our brains.
Thanks for having me. I guess it'll be a while until I'm on next, so your brains can recover.
What's up, cuboids? You may have heard the news. Subway bread isn't actually bread, or more specifically, a court in Ireland said that Subway's bread contains too much sugar to be considered bread. Okay, let's dig into this a bit and maybe talk about bread and sandwiches. So what's all this about? Why does an Irish court care what bread is? Well, this isn't really about bread, it's about VAT, which is value-added tax, exists in many countries, including Ireland. Other countries such as Canada call this GST, Goods and Services Tax. Now, not all countries have a VAT or a GST, but many do. To an end consumer, this is generally seen as a type of sales tax. What VAT or GST is charged on will generally vary by country. Here in Canada, many groceries are GST exempt, but there are things which can be purchased at a grocery store for which GST is charged. So, certain alcohol, carbonated soft drinks, some juices, candy, chocolate bars, chips, and such things have GST applied. Now, there's an attempt for this to separate a true grocery food meant for cooking from an unhealthy piece of junk food or snack, okay? Though we could poke around at the specifics and find some odd things such as chocolate chips and cooking wines which are tax exempt, generally that's the idea. If it's junk type food, you're going to have to pay tax on it. So that's Canada. Ireland has similar rules for VAT. Certain food and drink are VAT exempt, and this is where Subway comes in. There's a concept called a staple food in Ireland. For a bread to be considered a staple product, the law states that its sugar content cannot exceed 2% of the weight of flour included in the dough. Subway's bread has a 10% sugar to flour ratio. Now, what prompted this was an appeal by a Subway franchise who was seeking a refund for some VAT payments made in 2004 and 2005. This isn't really new. If Subway bread isn't bread, it hasn't been bread since before 2004. It hasn't been bread since that rule came up. So it's really more like the court is reinforcing their decision rather than making it. So did Ireland say that Subway's bread isn't really bread? It depends how you consider the statement that they made. I quote this from the ruling. To exclude the bread used by the appellant in their sandwiches from being considered as bread under paragraph 12 of the second schedule, as the sugar content in the bread exceeded the percentage allowed in the schedule. Now, that sentence itself has a bit of a contradiction. They call it bread twice. They also state that it can't be considered bread under paragraph 12 of the second schedule. It goes on to say, the schedule excluded bread from the 0% rate where any of a number of specified ingredients exceeded the allowed percentages. So again, they call it bread. The court clearly repeatedly refers to the product in question as bread. They don't come out saying, we determine that Subway cake used in their sandwich treats cannot be called bread, or Subway bread substitute products aren't actually bread. Even every headline repeating the same statement says that Subway bread isn't bread, but calls it bread in doing so. It's a bit of a semantic issue, but it seems like we're still calling it bread, just not bread that fits the standards of a staple. Looking at the actual Court of Appeal document didn't give much more clarification. Indeed, it details the paragraph 12 mentioned in many articles and states, and I quote, 2. In this subparagraph, bread means food for human consumption manufactured by baking dough composed exclusively of a mixture of cereal flour and any one or more of the ingredients mentioned in the following sub-clauses in quantities not exceeding the limitation, if any, specified for each ingredient. And there are a number of different ones, but the relevant bullet point in this case reads, 2. Fat, sugar, and bread improver, subject to the limitation that the weight of any ingredient specified in this subclause shall not exceed 2% of the weight of flour included in the dough. So it does not meet the definition of bread in this sense. The document then clarifies. 67. The respondent submits that the plain meaning of the words above is as follows. Bread is composed of a mixture of cereal flour and any one or more of a number of ingredients. If the permitted limit for any one or more of those ingredients is exceeded, the product is not bread as defined. I accept the respondent's submission. The bread in question is in fact a sweet dough, and the trial judge did not fall into error in so concluding. So here, it is not called bread, but simply sweet dough. If we want to be really picky here, the absurd-seeming headlines do seem to correctly be stating that Subway bread isn't bread, but only in this specific definition of bread. I went to the Irish Tax and Customs page on bread and bakery products to see if I could get more info. The page doesn't get into specifics of ingredient ratios, but it specifically mentions that products such as garlic bread, onion bread, and fennel bread don't usually fit the ingredient definition of bread, and so are charged VAT at a reduced rate. So there are a number of different VAT rates depending on your product. Some products which have VAT applied include bagels, croissants, cakes, and biscuits. So the explanation uses the word bread to describe garlic, onion, and fennel bread. It seems the Irish government doesn't take issue with calling them bread, but just don't want them to get a VAT exemption which exists for bread. If they really didn't consider the food to be bread, they might take issue with it being marketed or sold under the word bread, which has not happened. But this is a tax issue after all, and this isn't one related to ethics in advertising or something of the sort. That would be a complete other government department that would care about something like that. Now, a quick look at Subway's official website for Ireland has a page on breads, toppings, and final touches. The word bread is found throughout the page and elsewhere on the site. Now, we can contrast this with the laws in Canada, which will not allow non-dairy products to use the name milk if they don't contain milk of a mammal. In the US, such products are sold as soy milk, soy yogurt, almond milk, and so forth. In Canada, these are simply beverages, and the word yogurt style is the closest thing you can find to calling a yogurt substitute yogurt. Many people have chosen to take this ruling to mean that Ireland says that Subway bread isn't bread. But while this makes for nice headlines and true in limited sense, I don't think that is a very accurate or useful statement. It's worth mentioning that a McDonald's Big Mac bun, which is smaller than a 6-inch Subway bread, has more sugar in it. But then the name bun is also used in cinnamon bun or hot cross bun, so I don't think there's any trouble there. Now, this story reminds me a bit of the headlines claiming that Congress declared that pizza was a vegetable, and I covered this on the show back in 2011. It was never about pizza being a vegetable, but a ruling about whether tomato paste, a concentrated tomato product, was considered a vegetable serving in the amounts that it was in pizza. A usual vegetable serving is a half cup, but tomato paste got an exemption to be considered a serving at 1/8 of a cup. Pizza being a vegetable is a ludicrous idea. Pizza containing vegetables is an objectively true statement, though one may take issue with whether the food contains a whole vegetable serving. Legal battles over sandwiches happen frequently. I would ask you, what do you consider counts as a sandwich? Bread, some filling, another piece of bread? Sure, easy. How about a wrap? If a wrap counts as a sandwich, would a tortilla also count as a sandwich? How about a soft shell taco? Fajita? Burrito? So if a soft shell taco counts, would a hard shell taco also be a sandwich? How about an open face sandwich? Doesn't have 2 pieces of bread. How about a hamburger? How about a hot dog? What about the KFC Double Down, which has bacon, cheese, and sauce sandwiched between 2 chicken fillets? No bread. Chicken fillets are breaded. Then is a chicken fillet itself a sandwich? Extreme loose definitions include Pop-Tarts and ravioli as sandwiches, but those aren't commonly included. When you ask most people if that's a sandwich, they would probably say no. So when it matters really depends on what's at stake. A Massachusetts judge decided that a burrito was not a sandwich. In this case, a Panera Bread Company location had an agreement to have exclusive rights to be the only sandwich shop in a mall. A Mexican grill opened in the shopping center and sold burritos. Judge Locke stated, and I quote, "A sandwich is not commonly understood to include burritos, tacos, and quesadillas, which are typically made with a single tortilla and stuffed with a choice filling of meat, rice, and beans." Chefs and other expert witnesses support this idea. Basically, in that case, whether or not it was a sandwich had bearing on that legal case. So he's allowed to say that. It probably doesn't have much bearing outside of this actual case. So one could easily say that an ice cream sandwich is a sandwich, but I would hardly expect to be part of a soup and salad menu on the menu in a restaurant, for example. These kind of semantic questions can be confusing, even if most people will generally have an understanding of what one might mean when they say sandwich, even though there are sort of some edge cases there. Consider, for example, the question of what is a sport? A strict definition might include only team sports, which have a competition which includes athleticism. Things like esports, basically competitive video games, blurs the line if one allows one video game to be a sport, why not all of them? Surely some video games require reflexes, some physical abilities, others do not. So do we draw a line there? Do we say that some games which require hand-eye coordination are sports, but are RPG sports if they're only turn-based and they don't actually require any sort of reflex or athleticism? Chess is considered a sport, but doesn't require athleticism or physical dexterity. I've seen it argued that chess and poker are sports. How about snakes and ladders? Most people wouldn't think so. Still, most people have a general agreement of what is considered a sport if they're asked. And there's going to be some cases where there's going to be a dispute, but people generally have an idea of what a sandwich, or what a sport, or what bread is. Is Subway's bread bread? I'd say yes, and despite the ruling of an Irish court, Subway is still referring to its sweet dough as bread. Since for VAT purposes the bread does not fit a strict definition of bread used to exempt it from that tax, it is perhaps technically accurate to say that the ruling states that bread isn't bread, as contradictory as that very statement may be. Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Did you mean to say wait?
I did. For those who are listening to this, we just had to retake that about 7 times because I kept saying the wrong thing. And so if Darren
That's a
said
good
that,
answer.
he would be wrong. You can cut that.
Let's just blame it on Darren.